So, welcome to today's live stream on 9/11 Mysteries, a documentary which you're not going to find on YouTube, alas. If you search for 9/11 Mysteries, I think you're going to find a number of links to these horrible conspiracy theories about 9/11. But if you look for 9/11 Mysteries on Odysee, which is where I gave the link in the description for this video for you to watch it, if you had a chance to watch it before today's live stream, you'd see there wasn't just one copy. I think there were 7, 8, 9, 10 copies of it on there. And I don't remember when I first saw this documentary, but it's one of my more favorite documentaries about the events of 9/11. 9/11 has a particular importance for me. I was in the air that day, actually, coming back from military reserve duty on the weekend, and I had purposely stayed a day to see my family. And as a result, I was in the air on September 11th. My plane got diverted. We landed, and uh, we weren't told anything. Our pilot didn't say anything when we landed. It just said the airport's closed for the rest of the day. And so a number of us sort of banded together, got a hotel room together, and we just sort of started watching the news. And for those who were in America at the time, they just kept showing the towers falling over and over and over. And I- for someone who was there, who experienced it, who was in an airplane that day and was watching it with other people and measuring my reactions against theirs, we were all in shock. There wasn't really a question of how this happened. Uh, we didn't really know. Later on, it was Osama bin Laden and all these other things, but we were really focused on how do we get home to our families. The FAA has closed the skies, and they didn't tell us. We didn't know at the time they were going to be closed for the next 3 days. So many of us, I was helping people get rental cars, and I didn't. I was a poor student at the time. I didn't have any money to rent a car for what it was going for at that time. So I just decided to wait it out, and that's a different story. Maybe I can tell a different time. But the point is to say that if I think about what I was feeling on 9/11, I was thinking about how I was in shock at what had happened, but I was thinking about how do I get back home? And just seeing how everybody felt very fragile, but also very friendly. We were all trying to help each other. There was a lot of goodwill though in those days after 9/11 on the streets of America. As someone who was experiencing it as a stranger, I was in Cleveland at the time. That's where my flight got diverted. So only years later, and I would say so September 11th happens in 2001, and it isn't until 2006 that I first start to look at the official story. And the shock has worn off, the emotional resonance, which remember, 9/11 was used as a pretext to get us into war in the Middle East. And this has all been telegraphed by the Project for the New American Century, which had a white paper which asked for a new Pearl Harbor event in order to galvanize the American people. This is all there on the internet. It's not a conspiracy theory. And once you have some distance, you can look back and say, well, don't those buildings look like they're falling like a, a demolition? But realistically, that really gets people going. So just step aside from the first two buildings. And I think for me, always the unlock code for when I want to have a discussion with people about 9/11 is to ask about Building 7. So I'll say, do you know about Building 7? Do you know what it was? The Solomon Brothers building. And to ask them, okay, well, if you don't know what it is, did you know that it fell into its own footprint on 9/11? And that the owner of the building said that he told the fire marshal to just pull it, and that pull it is a term in demolition used to pull the trigger. And that later on, his aide said, oh, he meant pull the firefighters out. But there had been no firefighters in the building since 10 o'clock. And he was talking about 4 o'clock is when he said pull it. But the only way you could pull it is that the demolition charges had to be set sometime before, not the day before, some time before, months. But if Building 7 was rigged to be demolished, why? For what purpose? And if Building 7 could be demolished, why couldn't Buildings 1 and 2 be demolished? And so, what I love about 9/11 Mysteries is it goes into that question of, well, what does it mean to be, what does it mean to demolish a building? And they have several of these experts from, I think, one company called Controlled Demolition Inc., I think might be the name of the company. There's not a lot of companies in the world that do controlled demolitions, but they said the goal is to make a building fall into its basement. So as the documentary shows us, the problem is if the narrative about 9/11 is that these planes crashed, started a fire, and then the fires caused a catastrophic collapse. The premise is that fire causes steel buildings to collapse. But the only two steel buildings that have collapsed due to fire on 9/11 were buildings 1 and 2, and then apparently building 7. In 2017, for those of you who remember, there was an apartment fire in London. The Grenfell Tower burned. It was due to some cladding, some just government incompetence, not a big surprise, but government incompetence that allowed this cladding, which was flammable, to stay around the building for an extended amount of time. Anyway, it lights up. This building burns for 60 hours. A steel frame building burns for 60 hours. Now, mind you, a jet plane hadn't crashed into it, but the entire building was burning, unlike towers 1 and 2, where only parts of the building were burning. But it didn't collapse into its own footprint. Why not? I thought that when a steel building gets lit on fire, it collapses into its own footprint. So you have all of these academics, these physicists, people like Stephen Jones, who were ignored. They wouldn't be allowed to show. You have to look at Building 7 collapsing into its own footprint and then disbelieve your eyes. So you show another controlled demolition next to it. You look at Building 7, and it's the classic meme from Lord of the Rings, where they show the pillow and they show Hobbit, and they say, "What's the difference?" And they say it's the same thing. So you have to show this building getting demolished. You show Building 7, and you say, "Oh, those are not at all related." It's the opposite of that meme. So Stephen Jones and a number of other people, Richard Gage from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, who I had a chance to see one of the talks he gave in Kansas City a number of years ago. But they talk about how this has to happen. And part of that is charges have to be placed on steel frames. And then they leave a mark because they're put at a certain angle. And if you see, there's footage, there's footage of the 9/11 ground zero with that characteristic 45-degree cut where you'd put a charge. The other problem is, what is all the molten metal doing down there? They have reporters on the scene saying that people's boots were melting. There's rivers of molten metal flowing, and that molten metal was flowing for weeks. But how does fire, which is lighting carpet, furniture, etc., remember all the jet fuel explodes out as far as we can see. So it isn't as if, and once that jet fuel burns out, that's it. You still have to somehow burn the steel. That causes a building to collapse, and then what? There's liquid molten metal flowing for weeks afterwards. It doesn't make any sense. So on top of that, Stephen Jones and Richard Gage and a number of other people always take us through slow mos of the video and show us pop outs. We see explosions happening. We have testimony from firefighters who were there at ground zero saying, "We heard explosions. They told us this building was coming down," etc. How would that be known? How would you know the building was going down? This is to say nothing. And 9/11 Mysteries doesn't cover this, but the reporter, I think, for the BBC, and BBC has deleted this footage, but it still floats around out there. You can find it on the internet, of a reporter reporting the collapse of the Solomon Brothers building, but the building is behind her, which means that someone gave her this script to read, but the building hadn't fallen yet. You can see it right behind her. She's talking about, because she doesn't know what Building 7 looks like. She's a reporter just reporting. She's not familiar with the New York skyline. I don't think most New Yorkers would have known what Building 7 was, so that's not a fault on her. But she's just reading what she was handed. Someone handed her a script, but they clearly handed it to her too early. They probably should have handed to her 20 or 30 minutes later after the building had actually collapsed. But she's reading about the collapse of the building before the collapse of the building. Also, the documentary talks about the shift in the foundations. So how does a fire at the top of a building cause the foundations of the building to shift? That those are two different forces. What sort of force is required to shift the foundation of a building versus a fire? Let's be realistic here. So as I'm talking about all this, and we also see in the documentary this iron metal fusion, this strange, horrible bending of metal, which again, fire doesn't do that. All that fire can do is potentially weaken steel, but it can't cause it to be warped and it can't cause it to be fused with rock and concrete. It cannot blow out human remains explosively such that you have like 1-inch human bone remains on the Deutsche Bank building across the street. That's not caused by fire. That's caused by explosions. That's caused by demolitions. As I'm saying this all to you now in a live stream, I'm realizing in 2024, You can say this sort of stuff and no one blinks. But in 2006, when I first started to hear about it and started to put together different pieces, I my friends and family were quite skeptical to say the least, and understandably so, because I think what makes 9/11 difficult for a lot of people is that you have different pieces that don't cohere, but there's clearly a problem. So, for example, if you have these planes going in to the buildings by these hijackers, whoever they might have been, it doesn't mean that they necessarily got on the phone to Larry Silverstein and they were buddies. You can have different parts of an operation being handled by different people, not even one mastermind, but let's say several different handlers handling different parts of an operation. And so it looks to be one coherent operation, some guy on a satellite phone in a cave who is a former CIA asset, some guy on a camera on a satellite phone in a cave in Afghanistan who we can't get him. He coordinates an attack, which, by the way, Saudi hijackers, 19 of the 15 of the 20 hijackers for Saudi, however it might be, are one of our greatest allies. All these Saudi hijackers can still do this, and you can also have Larry Silverstein take out insurance on his buildings specifically for terrorism. You can have an asbestos problem within the building, which had been delayed, but would have cost at least $1 billion to fix, which Larry Silverstein didn't have. And so the best thing to do would be to get rid of those buildings, but you can't really get rid of those buildings unless you have something spectacular happen. And then guess what? All that asbestos has to be breathed in by first responders, firefighters. Christine Todd Whitman telling everybody that the air is safe to breathe at ground zero. So all these New Yorkers and Americans, we stupidly trust our government. We go out there, and all those people died, and they have to fight for benefits for their lung cancer, and all these people are dying because we wanted to help cover up for a billionaire who collected from insurance companies not once but twice for an act of terrorism that he clearly foresaw and planned for. This all comes back to, well, why did this happen? Well, because somebody wanted it to happen and they made arrangements, and it could look like something other than what it was, which is a theft. There were so many thefts happening that day. There was theft of gold. There were put options placed on United Airlines the day after, which expired mysteriously. So someone knew that something bad was going to happen to the airline stocks. Um, so there was foreknowledge. We're not even going to get into the dancing Israelis. That's probably a different video. But dancing Israelis, go look at James Corbett has done a good 20-minute video on the dancing Israelis. Um, so what you want to look for is these different pieces because each of them represent their own thing. So why were all the hijackers trained on U.S. bases? Why, if they were devout Muslims, were they hanging out with strippers and doing drugs all the time and drinking alcohol? It doesn't matter. If you're a devout Muslim who thinks I'm going to strike a blow against the United States and go to heaven, well, what are you not observing any of the tenets of the Muslim faith while you're doing that? That doesn't make any sense. But in this narrative, and again, the FBI finds a hijacker's passport on the ground in New York. So let me get this straight. The plane flies into the building. I'm just repeating it. It's so stupid. The plane flies into the building. The guy, I guess, must have had his passport in his pocket. The passport flies out of his pocket, I guess, out of the World Trade Center building, and then falls down to the ground. And then the FBI can find it on the ground and say, "Wow, isn't that great? The hijacker left his passport here." I mean, it's so. You look back now, and I'm happy to put my hand up and say I was stupid. I fell for it, just like everyone else, because I was traumatized by what had happened. But when you look back at it now, it looks so stupid. You cannot believe that they expected us to believe that this guy's passport flew out of his pocket when he crashed into a building at full speed, and somehow it came down and landed, and we found it. I mean, that's one of the stupidest things. But it's one of the least stupid when you look at all the other stuff. The fact that we have um, this controlled demolition of Building 7. That's always what I come back to. So I always come back to, do you, when I'm out talking to somebody who's never heard about 9/11, say, Stephen, I have some questions. Like I've heard could have been an inside job. What's going on? I'll start by saying inside job implies a single mastermind. I don't believe that. I think that there were different moving parts here. Different people wanted different things for their own ends. I don't think that Larry Silverstein necessarily cared about a war in the Middle East. He's a Zionist, so he clearly wants something done in favor of Israel. Israel was very in favor of 9/11, galvanizing the American people to think about terrorism in their neck of the woods. So I'm not saying that that wasn't it, but he wasn't interested in the same way that the project for the new American century would be. If you're interested, as I said in the beginning of the stream, go look at the PNAC document in which they call for a new Pearl Harbor. They say that the American people need a new Pearl Harbor. So the PNAC people have their own thing. The neocons in Bush's cabinet who wanted to go to war, they needed an excuse. Um, Financiers who wanted to make some money on put options on United Airlines stock, they had a reason. Raytheon, McDonald, sorry, not McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed, all these other war suppliers, they want to supply weapons for the quote unquote war on terror, which is never going to end. So many different people had reasons that they would benefit from 9/11. The only people who didn't benefit was the American people. And so we were the easiest people to fool. So as time goes on, however, cracks appear. And the same thing happened with the JFK assassination. If you polled most people, I think in the first decade after the JFK assassination, most people accepted the government explanation because it made them sleep better at night, right? We found out that this one lone assassin with no help shot the president and there was a magic bullet, but we're not going to talk about that. 90%, I think, people expected the war, took the Warren Commission report at face value. And then I think 20 years pass where it's safe to talk. And I think that's the thing is we're safely past 2001. We're 20 years on, more than 20 years on. And now it's safe to talk about and say, well, what actually happened that day? And what happened as a result of that? So what happened as a result of JFK's assassination, et cetera? And we could look at all of that and who would have benefited from JFK's assassination. And we look at the magic bullet theory. And I've been to the book depository building in Dallas and I've looked and there's been too much work done by people who are far smarter than I am, far more learned about the issue to just say, it isn't what we told it. It doesn't mean that we have a totally coherent alternative theory. It just means this official explanation from the government is false. So I think that's the same thing when you look at 9/11, whatever the grand explanation is less relevant than the fact that almost everything the government is telling us is not true about it. And I think that's key. I'm going to shut up for a moment and look at some of the questions in the chat. Alan Sabrowski. I think this is somebody. Was he a whistleblower? Saborowski. If you're still around, Ferrallo, let us know about this person. I do think he was involved somehow. Egypt Air 990 was, in my view, a dry run for remote hijacking of a flight. Yeah, and there were other. We had been planning for. So Bush goes up there. Condi Rice goes up and says, "Well, I don't think anyone could have foreseen that that people would fly planes into a building. There's a government document that shows planes going into the World Trade Center building. It was talked about, it was planned for, and it was simulated in war games. That's why you'll hear one of the operators say, is this real world or simulation? Because they'd run simulations like this. And that's one of the ways to fool people is to run simulations similar to an event that's going to happen. And that way they don't know what's happening on the day that something bad happens. Will you talk to Arthur Kwan Lee? Tomas, I don't know who that is. He said, oops, I dropped the lift key. I don't know. But if you want to send me more information, I'm always happy to look. Basil Gildersleeve. I was in New York City that day working in a store on Fifth Avenue. I remember someone telling me one of the towers had fallen and imagine it toppling sideways. I never thought it could fall through its core. Yeah, neither did any of us because it can't unless it was demolished. Sylvester K. I remember about a week after the terrible event, CNN had a show about what was going to happen next, featuring Pearl, Wolfowitz, Comey, Bolton. I ran out of the room screaming. I mean, this is like a murderer's row of war criminals. The U.S. economy structure is literally structured to benefit the most bloodthirsty administration. Yeah, that's true, but also the financiers. Yes, the specific special interests and the ones who are running it. Tower 7 was largely vacated, then fell for some reason. Yeah, who knows? And the documentary says what was in that building. The SEC, which was auditing Enron, The special command center for New York City was there. There were a number of really important structures, and those things were built. It had its own water supply, power supply, but Rudy Giuliani chose not to be in that bunker. I don't know why. Did someone tell him not to go there? Jamie, weren't they running a simulation? Yes, they were. They were running, and they were running a simulation on September 10th as well. And I'm trying to remember. Vigilant Guardian is a name that sticks in my head as one of the simulations. I don't think it was necessarily running that day, but they were running simulations in which jets were away, and so that's part of plausible deniability. If our jets are away on training missions, it's harder to scramble them to intercept the jets. We didn't even. I mean, 9/11 mysteries. I don't think gets into the Pentagon as deeply as I would like, but I mean, what hit the Pentagon? Where is the plane? What is the leftover of that? Did you know Cheney was in charge of anti-terrorism during 2001? No, ever. I mean, Dick Cheney. I mean, he's accountable for what? Hopefully, we get Stephen back. I don't know what that means, Alex. Tomas, if you read the book Bananas, How the United Fruit Company Shaped the World, it outlines all the key personnel. It's a wonderful book, Tomas. I actually, I don't remember which book review I did for my channel in which I recommend this book, but it's a great book, and I want to say it's not even 100, it's not even 200 pages. It's 180 pages. There's another one called Rotten Fruit, but there's a lot when we get to talking about what happened with Hawaii and other things in which basically fruit runs things, how we overthrow governments. Um, it's pretty shocking. Say personnel in Iraq was largely involved with United Fruit, OSS, yeah, possibly. How could anybody get the hijackers to fly planes into the buildings? How did they do that? Leo, it's a great question. The thing is, it's not hard to find suicide bombers, people who believe in things. Um, one of the one of the things I was reflecting on, Robert Fisk has written several books, one about Lebanon called Pity the Nation. And he said he talked to a Marine who was in the barracks that day when the suicide bomber, he was driving a truck, and he drove into the Marine barracks and killed 280 something Marines. I think 283, if I'm remembering correctly. But he said he could see the driver, and the driver had a smile on his face. So we don't know what the motivations of people are to do things. And as I say, the narrative doesn't fit. If I'm a devout Muslim who is striking a foe against the great Satan, why am I hanging out with strippers and doing coke, in the weeks leading up to this? It doesn't match. Doesn't make any sense. Um, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, great book. It's not here on this core shelf, but it's back behind here. Great book. That will be reviewed on this channel next year. I've heard many of these points, but have never dug into it. Seems the general public is still very resistant to. Well, Amos King, I don't know that resistant. I don't think they care. I mean, why would you care? There's sports, there's the Kardashians, there's so many others, video games, there's so many other things that are more important than whether or not 3,000 American civilians were murdered in order to get us into a war in the Middle East to profit Raytheon, Lockheed, and Larry Silverstein and Israel's general policy in the region. I mean, why would we care about that? We'd rather play video games and watch sports and I don't know what else. But digging into 9/11, that is not interesting to the American people. Do you listen to Democracy Now? Sometimes when you say listen to, I don't, let's say, listen to anything regularly. I'm trying to usually study and research for whatever it is I'm looking at. So, for example, when I was doing Norm Finkelstein's book, I watched his interview on Democracy Now. There's several people who I've watched their interview on Democracy Now, and on the subjects in which I'm engaged on, they're good. Obviously, on subjects in which I totally disagree with them, in which I'm categorically opposed to them, um, I don't care what they have to say. But they are a useful outlet, and I think a helpful outlet to get some of alternative ideas out there than what the general public would say. I believe the official narrative as whole is too large. I mean, the holes. I mean, to describe them as holes, they just don't make any sense. Norman Mineta, it's not explained in the if you read the 9/11 commission report, which is something like 500 pages, it's not explained in there how Norman Mineta is in the command bunker talking about Cheney sitting there watching a plane approach, and a young man says, do the orders still stand? What orders? Probably shoot down orders. Do the orders still stand? And that's never explained. What was Norman Mineta doing in the bunker? Why did Cheney not not contradict this. I think Cheney just thought it would be better not to say anything. I know about the dancing Israelis. Like I said, this is just something. There was a I don't remember, someone was at a Charlie Kirk event, and they said he asked Charlie. He said, "Hey, when you were in Israel, did you go to any dance parties? I heard they're awesome dancers." And Charlie didn't really know what was going on. And then he turns to the audience and says, "You all need Google dancing Israelis, and you'll see like they're really great at dancing." And it was just awesome. A great way to get people to look at things. But that again, that's another piece of the pie. What was going on? And you, as I say, you can look at any single one of these, and they're their own story. Able Danger, um, any of the other things related to this. Bin Laden himself, the whole story of Zero Dark 30. That is presented to us as that's the narrative. That's how we killed Bin Laden, and yet all of these Marines, all these SEALs mysteriously die as a result later on to make sure that they don't say anything. Arthur Quanley is the self-proclaimed only Christian artist who is closely aligned with Catholics who are verbally vocalizing their dissatisfaction with the way special interests are. Thomas, this isn't really. I don't really do interviews. This is a book review channel. But if there's any books that you can refer me to or any articles, I'd be happy to do that. And I'm always happy to learn. But I don't want to commit to doing interviews when that's out of my lane. I think I can really add value as a book reviewer, and not so much. I do interviews in other parts of my life, and I don't only want to do that. Raheem Aziz, could the things that flew in the building have been remote controlled UAVs shaped as planes? Raheem, I've heard other people talk about this. I think this is one of the interesting things is when you start digging and you start opening up your mind to things, you you start to be open because you don't need your narrative to be correct for you to feel safe about the world. Okay? If you're willing to say, I don't know, let me look into that. I don't know what a remote controlled UAV of that shape would look like. I have no idea. Who were the people on the passenger manifest that day? They were mysteriously shorter than usual. Um, what about all those cell phone calls? Any of us who've been on a plane since 9/11, try making a phone call at 20,000 feet from your cell phone today in 2024. And we're supposed to believe those cell phone recordings from 2001 with cell phone technology in 2001, they were making phone calls. And then people call, say, "Hey, mom, it's so and so, first name, last name." I don't remember what it was, but so it's Steven Heiner. So, "Hi, mom, it's Steven Heiner." Like you would never do that, not even in a panic, maybe. But we have all these recordings. How were those cell phone calls made? As I say, I don't know. I don't know. But it's clear that it's it's part of a larger narrative of lies, right? Leo, do I live in Paris now? So coming to you from an undisclosed location, but I have an address in Paris. LOL, video games making that list is crazy. I've seen that Kirk clip. Yeah, I mean it was hilarious. I love that guy. I don't know who he was, but he just turned to the audience and says, "Hey, just Google dancing Israelis." It was so awesome. Bread and circus might be the most effective social weapon in the culture war. Machiavelli was right. Uh, Machiavelli was right about a number of things. He's wrong about several others, but I do think that if you haven't read The Prince, The Prince is basically a description of what is going on in today's culture. Um, that guy was a Catholic. LOL, great bit. I don't believe the Zero Dark 30 narrative. Yeah, and I think that's frustrating for someone like myself who is interested in special operations and looking at how things are done behind the scenes. I'd like to know what really happened, but I know Zero Dark 30. Jessica Chastain is a fantastic actress, but it's all a lie. And I think that's what's frustrating is you want to watch Zero Dark 30 and learn something. And there is tradecraft in there, and there is truth about the betrayal, the outing of the CIA station chief in Pakistan, and the atmosphere there. So there are bits of it which are very true, which are very true to life. And for someone like myself who's interested in spy tradecraft, looking at some of that, that's all true, and I appreciate that. But the whole narrative of this is how we found Bin Laden, and of course it has to be a girl because girl power, etc. Just a little too convenient, unfortunately. Most King, on the topic of historical events and unofficial Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin was a great read about the Russian front of World War II. And I have another book about Stalingrad that I'll be getting to. There as so many books, so little time. I appreciate it. Everyone always in the comment section, you need to read this book. I love it. Keep it coming. But just keep in mind, you can't see it, but there's a whole pile of books just surrounding this bookshelf. and I'm trying to get to things as quickly as I can. Speaking of getting to things, I've got to end the stream because I am running a stream for Palestine Bookshelf. Shameless plug for the other channel. We're running a stream on the documentary Atrocity Inc. by Max Blumenthal, which talks about all the speaking of lies around a date. So lies about September 11th. So that one's going to be lies about um, October 7th. So if you want to go to Palestine Bookshelf in the next 30 seconds or so, I'll switch over there and start that stream. Sama, don't forget to like the stream. Thank you, Sama. I appreciate that. Share it, like it, subscribe. I will see you on the other channel in just a moment. Thanks for joining today, everybody.